The wind screamed across the barren land, carrying sharp flakes of ice that cut against the skin like blades. The world was white and endless, a frozen wasteland where nothing gentle could survive for long. In the middle of this storm lay a figure, so small and fragile that she seemed like a shadow against the snow. It was a young alien girl, her body curled tightly, her thin arms wrapped around herself in a desperate attempt to keep the cold away. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each weaker than the last. Her skin, once glowing with life, had turned pale. A faint shade of blue spread across her lips and cheeks. The storm did not care. It pressed harder, burying her under layers of ice. Her tiny fingers clawed at the frozen ground, trying to lift her body, but she had no strength left. Her eyes, wide and terrified, blinked slowly as she stared into the endless white sky above. She wanted to cry, but even her tears had frozen before they could fall. The silence of death was closing around her. Every beat of her heart was slower, weaker. The cold whispered promises of sleep, the kind from which no one wakes. She thought this was the end. She thought she would vanish here, another forgotten body swallowed by the storm. Then, through the howling wind, came a sound. Heavy footsteps pressing against the frozen ground. At first, she thought it was only her mind playing tricks on her fading senses. But the sound grew louder, clearer. Something was moving toward her. A tall shadow appeared in the white blur of the storm. A human wrapped in heavy gear, struggling against the violent wind. His face was hidden behind a visor, his body covered with protective layers. But his movements were strong, determined. He scanned the wasteland as if searching for something, as if he had been drawn here by fate. The girl tried to move, to cry out, but her voice was only a whisper carried away by the wind. Still, the human's head turned. He froze, staring into the snow where her small body lay half buried. Without hesitation, he pushed forward, each step sinking deep into the icy ground until he reached her side. He knelt beside her, brushing the snow away with rough, gloved hands. Her eyes met his for a brief second. They were wide with fear, wide with disbelief. She had heard stories about humans, stories filled with warnings, stories that painted them as beasts. Yet here one was, kneeling in the storm, staring down at her with something she had never seen before. Concern. The human pressed his hand gently against her chest, searching for life. Her heart was weak, but it still fought. A spark still remained inside her, fragile and faint. He leaned closer, his breath fogging against the glass of his visor. He muttered something she could not understand, his voice low but steady, as if speaking to himself. Carefully, he lifted her tiny body into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile shell trembling against the unrelenting cold. His chest felt the faintest shiver that ran through her. He pulled her close, wrapping his heavy cloak around them both, shielding her from the storm. The warmth of his body pressed against hers, and for the first time in hours she felt something other than the bite of ice. Her mind swirled in confusion. This was not what she had been told about humans. She had believed they were dangerous, cruel, uncaring. Yet this one was holding her as if she mattered, as if her life was worth more than his own safety. The storm roared louder, pushing against them, but the human did not falter. He shifted her weight in his arms, securing her tightly, and began walking. His boots sank deep into the snow. His body leaned forward against the wind, but his pace was steady. Every step was a battle against the wasteland, but he carried her, as though nothing could make him stop. The girl's head rested weakly against his chest. Through the thick layers of his gear she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, strong and alive. It was different from her own failing pulse, a reminder that he was warm while she was cold, strong while she was fading. Something about that steady sound gave her a small thread of hope. Her eyes fluttered open once more. The storm blurred everything into white chaos, but all she could see was him, the human's figure towering over the storm, his arms protecting her, his warmth seeping into her fragile body. She wanted to speak, to ask why he was helping her. But no words would come. Only silence. Only shivers. The human did not stop. He knew that if he slowed, if he hesitated, she would be gone. Her breaths were already faint. Her heartbeat was already weak. Time was not their ally. He pressed forward, searching for shelter, refusing to let her slip away. The wasteland stretched endlessly, but his determination was endless too. He carried her not as a burden, but as something precious. Every step was filled with the same silent promise. He would not let her die here. The girl closed her eyes again, surrendering to the exhaustion. Yet now, instead of the cold darkness of death, she felt a small flame of warmth in the arms that held her. For the first time since the storm began, she believed she might survive. The cave walls groaned as the storm howled outside. Snow and ice battered the entrance, threatening to seal it shut. Inside the dim shelter, the human lowered the fragile alien girl onto the frozen ground. His breath came in sharp bursts, steam rising from his visor. He pulled off one glove and pressed his fingers gently to her neck, searching again for life. Her pulse was there, faint and fragile like a candle about to die in the wind. The human sat back, his heart pounding. He was exhausted from carrying her, and the storm had drained his body of warmth. His rations were limited. His energy was fading. He knew that if he focused on saving her, his own chances of survival would drop sharply. He could keep the little strength he had for himself, leave her behind, and maybe reach the outpost alive. It was the logical choice. It was the safe choice. But as he looked at her small form curled on the ground, he knew logic was not enough. Her lips were blue, her body trembling with weakness. She had not chosen this storm, this fate. If he walked away, she would die within minutes. Her life depended entirely on his decision. He leaned back against the stone wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. His mind whispered reminders of the harsh truth. Supplies would not last if he shared them. His energy would break if he carried her through the storm for much longer. One life for two lives. It was cruel, but it was the way of survival in worlds like this. Yet his heart refused to listen. He opened his eyes again and stared at her face. Even in her weakness, there was something innocent, something unbroken about her. Her small chest rose and fell, each breath a fragile fight against death. She was not just a stranger. She was someone who still had a chance, and if he left her, the guilt would haunt him more than the storm ever could. The human reached into his pack, pulling out a small heat cell. It was meant to preserve his body temperature through the night. Without it, his risk of freezing would double. He stared at it for a long second, his jaw tightening. Then, without hesitation, he placed it against her body, wrapping the cloak tighter around her small frame. Her skin twitched faintly at the sudden warmth, her breathing lifting by a fraction. He exhaled slowly, accepting what he had just done. He had given away a piece of his survival for hers. His choice was made. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He had seen others die before. He had seen bodies left in the snow, frozen reminders of what happened when someone chose compassion over reason. Was he about to join them? Was this small act of mercy going to cost both their lives? He looked down at her again. Her eyelids fluttered as if she was fighting to wake. Her head shifted slightly toward the heat, clinging to the faint spark of life. That tiny movement was enough to silence the doubt in his chest. He had made the right choice. The storm outside roared like a beast, shaking the cave walls, but he held her close again, wrapping both arms around her. His cloak covered her completely now, his own body pressed against hers to share what warmth remained. Every second was a battle against exhaustion, but he refused to let her slip away. Her small hand twitched, brushing weakly against his chest. For a moment he thought it was only reflex, but then her fingers tightened ever so slightly as if holding on to him. That simple gesture crushed every remaining thought of leaving her. She had chosen him, even in her unconscious state. She was depending on him. The human leaned forward, whispering words she could not understand, promises she would never hear. "I won't let you go." As the hours passed, the cave grew colder. The heat cell dimmed, its power fading, but the warmth of his own body never left her. His muscles burned with fatigue, yet he held her tighter, every beat of his heart pushing against the silence of the storm. The impossible choice had been made, and there was no turning back. He knew he might pay the price, but he also knew one truth stronger than fear. If humanity meant anything at all, it was this: to stand against the cold, to fight for the weak, to give hope where none remained. And so, in that frozen wasteland, the human chose to carry not only his own survival, but hers too. The storm could take his strength, his safety, even his life, but it could not take his decision. The night dragged on, and the storm outside showed no sign of ending. The wind screamed like a living creature, forcing its way into every crack of the cave. Snow and ice piled at the entrance, threatening to bury them inside. The human adjusted, his hold on the alien girl, keeping her wrapped tightly against him. Her body was still cold, but no longer deathly still. Her faint shivers returned, proof that life was still inside her. He leaned his back against the stone wall, his body trembling with exhaustion. Every muscle ached from the journey through the wasteland. His arms felt heavy, yet he dared not loosen them. If he pulled away, even for a moment, the girl would sink back into the deadly cold. His own warmth was the only shield between her and death. The human lowered his head, listening to her shallow breaths. They came weak but steady now, each one a fragile victory. He could almost feel the fight inside her, a silent struggle to keep holding on. She was not giving up, and because of that, neither would he. The cave was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the dying heat cell. The flickering light cast long shadows across the walls, making the place look alive with movement. Every gust of wind outside rattled the stone, reminding him that they were still trapped in the heart of danger. The storm wanted them. It wanted to silence them both. His mind returned to the decision he had made. He had given away his chance of comfort, his survival gear, his rations. The storm could kill him now, but he had no regrets. He looked at the girl again, her fragile frame hidden under the layers of his cloak. She did not belong to his world. She was not his kind. Yet here he was, giving every last piece of himself to keep her alive. Her eyelids twitched, and slowly, her eyes opened. At first, they were clouded with weakness, barely able to focus. But then, they locked onto him. Wide, alien eyes staring into the visor of a human. She gasped softly, her breath catching in her throat. Fear flickered across her face as though she remembered the stories told about humans. Stories of beasts, monsters, conquerors. The human froze, worried that she would panic, that her fragile body would waste what little strength remained. Gently, he raised a hand and touched her shoulder, pressing her back into the warmth of his chest. He spoke softly, though he knew she could not understand his words. His voice was calm, steady, like a fire glowing against the cold. She blinked, watching him closely. Her body trembled, but not from the storm. It was the trembling of uncertainty, of not knowing whether this creature who held her was her savior or her end. Yet when his hand tightened gently around her, she felt no harm, only warmth, only safety. The girl exhaled weakly, her eyes closing, again, but this time with less fear. She let her head rest against him, surrendering to his strength. For the first time since the cold had taken her, she did not feel alone. The human shifted, pulling the cloak tighter. The storm roared, shaking the cave, but he ignored it. His focus was on the fragile life in his arms. Every minute stretched into an hour, every hour into eternity. He fought sleep, fought weakness, because he knew that if he gave in, the storm would win. At one point, the snow at the cave entrance shifted, collapsing inward. The cold air surged inside, cutting against his face like knives. He turned his body instantly, shielding the girl from the blast. His back took the full force of the icy wind. But he did not move. His jaw clenched, his muscles strained, but he stayed firm, holding her tighter. The storm could break against him, but it would not touch her again. The girl stirred, faintly pressing her small hands against his chest. It was not strength, but instinct, a sign that she felt his warmth and clung to it. Her fragile touch was enough to renew his resolve. Hours passed. The storm raged without mercy. Yet in that cave there was a battle of another kind, a battle of human endurance against alien fragility. A battle where warmth was the only weapon. The human refused to give in, and the girl, against all odds, kept breathing. When the first light of dawn filtered faintly through the cracks, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind softened, the snow slowed, and silence returned to the wasteland outside. The human lowered his head, his eyes heavy, but relief filled his chest. They had made it through the night. The girl was still alive, still in his arms, still breathing. He had fought the storm with nothing but his will and his warmth, and he had won. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried under silence and white. The cave still held the cold, but it no longer shook with the rage of the wind. For the first time in hours, the human allowed himself to relax his shoulders. He looked down at the fragile figure in his arms. Her breathing had steadied, her chest rising and falling with more strength than before. Her skin, once pale and lifeless, now carried a faint glow. The blue tint that had threatened to claim her was fading. Her lips moved slightly as if trying to form words, though no sound came out. The human studied her face carefully, unsure of what to expect. She was still weak, still fragile, but life had returned. Slowly, her eyes opened. At first, they fluttered against the light. Then they widened, locking onto him. The alien girl stared at the human holding her. For a long moment, neither moved, frozen not by the cold but by the weight of the silence between them. Her gaze shifted across his face, studying the visor that reflected her image back at her. Her expression trembled with fear. She remembered stories from her people, humans described as dangerous, as destroyers. Her heart pounded weakly, torn between the instinct to flee and the reality that she had no strength left to move. The human noticed the fear in her eyes. He did not move quickly. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, making himself seem less threatening. With one gloved hand, he slowly pushed back the hood of his cloak so that more of his face was visible through the visor. He whispered something, words she could not understand, but his tone was soft, calm, and steady. The girl blinked, her body still trembling. She could not understand his language, but she understood the way he spoke. It was not the voice of a beast. It was the voice of someone who meant no harm. Her lips parted, and a faint sound escaped, a fragile attempt at speech. Her throat was dry, her voice weak, but her effort showed she wanted to respond. The human reached into his pack and pulled out a small water flask. He lifted her gently, supporting her head with care, and brought the flask to her lips. At first she hesitated, unsure if it was safe, but the thirst inside her was stronger than her fear. She took a small sip, then another, the cold water running down her throat. Her body relaxed slightly. Her eyes softened, losing some of their fear. She looked at him again, and this time, there was something else in her gaze. Confusion? Yes, but also wonder. Why was he helping her? Why was this human giving her life instead of taking it away? The human placed the flask aside and pulled the cloak tighter around her. He pressed his own warmth closer to her frail body, ensuring she stayed safe from the lingering cold. Every move he made was slow, careful, as if he feared she might break. The girl's small hand twitched against his chest. At first it was only a reflex, but then her fingers curled slightly, holding onto the fabric of his suit. The gesture was weak, but it was not accidental. She was choosing to hold on to him. The human froze for a second, staring down at the fragile hand clinging to him. A wave of relief passed through him. She was not pushing him away. She was not giving in to fear. She was reaching for him. Her eyes closed again, but not from weakness alone. This time she closed them in trust. Her breathing steadied further, her body leaning fully into his chest as if she had accepted his presence. The human stayed silent, his arms secure around her. He did not know her name, her world, or her story. Yet he knew one thing with certainty. He had become the barrier between her life and death, and she had accepted him as that barrier. The cave grew brighter as the sun rose outside, light slipping through the cracks in the snow. The storm had left scars on the land, but inside the cave something new had begun. A fragile connection, born not of words but of survival. It was more than warmth that kept her alive now. It was the spark of trust, fragile yet real, burning in the cold wasteland. And in that moment both the human and the alien girl understood. They were no longer alone. The storm had ended, but the cold had not. The world outside the cave was buried under heavy snow, a silent wasteland of white. The human knew they could not stay hidden forever. Food was short, his heat supply nearly gone, and the girl's body, still too weak to survive without constant care. Survival meant moving forward, but before they could face the wasteland, he needed to earn something more important than strength. He needed her trust. The alien girl stirred in his arms, her large eyes opening slowly. She looked around, then back at him. Fear still lingered in her gaze, but it was no longer the wild fear of a hunted creature. It was the cautious watchfulness of someone who wanted to understand. The human shifted, loosening his cloak slightly to give her more space. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small ration bar, breaking it into smaller pieces. He held one out to her carefully, his gloved hand steady. The girl tilted her head, staring at the strange object. Her lips pressed together as if she wanted to refuse, but her hunger betrayed her. Her trembling fingers reached forward and took the piece, her movements uncertain. She brought it to her mouth and nibbled cautiously. The taste was foreign, but it filled her stomach with warmth she had not felt in days. When she finished, she glanced at him again, her expression softer. Her body was still frail, yet her eyes carried a flicker of gratitude. She placed a hand on her chest, a small gesture that seemed to mean, "Thank you." The human tilted his head, watching her. Slowly, he mimicked the gesture, pressing a hand against his own chest. She blinked, surprised, then gave a faint nod. A fragile connection grew stronger in that simple moment. Encouraged, he tried another gesture. He pointed to himself, then tapped his chest again, as if telling her his name. She frowned slightly, confused, but after a pause she copied the movement. Her lips formed a sound, weak and broken. Perhaps her own name. He could not understand the word, but the meaning was clear. They could not share language, but they could share meaning. The human smiled faintly under his visor. He reached out and placed his hand gently over hers. She did not pull away. Instead, she let her small hand rest in his, the coldness of her skin warming slowly in his touch. For the first time since the storm had thrown them together, there was peace between them. The silence of the cave no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a fragile bridge being built one gesture at a time. Hours passed as they exchanged small signs. He offered water, she accepted. She pointed toward the snow outside, then back at herself, trying to tell him something about her world. He did not understand, but he listened. She touched the stone wall, drew a line with her finger, and then pressed her hand to his chest again. He realized she was telling him about the storm, about danger, about survival. Though her body was weak, her will was strong. And with each attempt at communication, she showed him she wanted to live. She wanted to fight. The human felt something stir in his chest. He had carried her through the cold, given her warmth, but now she was giving him something back. Hope. As evening fell, he pulled the cloak tighter around them again. The temperature was dropping, but the fear of the storm no longer crushed them. The girl leaned against his chest willingly now, her small body trusting his strength. Her breathing was stronger, her heart steadier. Before she closed her eyes to rest, she reached out one last time, her hand pressing lightly against his arm. Her gaze met his, and in that look was a message clearer than words. She was no longer afraid. The human lowered his head, letting his hand rest gently on her shoulder. They had no common language, no shared history, yet in this frozen wasteland, they had built something greater than words, a fragile bond born of trust, of survival, of compassion. And though the night was long and the journey ahead dangerous, neither of them felt alone anymore. They had found the language of hope. The cave gave them shelter for a time, but it was not a home. The human knew it well. If they stayed too long, the cold would creep back and claim them both. Supplies were running low, and the girl needed more than warmth. She needed food, safety, and a place where the storm would not return. When the pale light of morning pushed through the cracks of snow, the human stood. His body ached from the long night, but he ignored it. He strapped his pack across his shoulders and knelt beside the girl. She was still weak, her body fragile, but her eyes opened when she felt his presence. He pointed toward the cave entrance, then back at her, making it clear they had to move. Her face showed fear at the thought of facing the wasteland again, but when she looked into his steady eyes, her fear softened. She gave a faint nod. The human lifted her carefully, wrapping her in the cloak once more. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, yet carrying her through the storm had drained his strength. This time, he knew they had to walk together. He set her gently on her feet. At first, her legs trembled under her small frame, nearly giving out. She clutched his arm for balance, her grip weak but determined. Step by step, she tried again, forcing herself to stand. The human placed his hand firmly against her back, guiding her forward, steadying her with every movement. Together, they pushed into the frozen world. The wasteland stretched in every direction, endless snow and broken ice. Sharp winds bit at their faces, but the storm had eased, leaving only the haunting silence of winter. Each breath was painful, the air so cold it burned the lungs. Still, the human pressed forward, watching carefully for danger. The girl walked beside him, her steps small but persistent. She stumbled often, but each time he caught her before she could fall. She began to guide him in subtle ways, pointing toward certain ridges, avoiding areas of cracked ice. She seemed to know this land, even in her weakness. He realized she was not just following him. She was helping him find the path. Hours passed, and the journey grew harder. The snow was deep, and his body screamed for rest. The girl saw his struggle. Though she could not speak his language, she tugged at his sleeve and pointed toward a line of jagged rocks ahead. He followed her direction, and soon they found a small break in the land where the wind was weaker. Her knowledge had spared them from walking into danger. They rested briefly, sharing water and what little food remained. The girl broke her portion in half, offering it back to him. Her hand trembled, but her eyes were steady. The human hesitated. He knew she needed it more, but when he saw the determination in her face, he accepted the gesture. For her, it was not just food. It was trust. When they moved again, the world seemed slightly less hostile. Their steps were slow but no longer desperate. They were no longer two strangers fighting alone. They were two lives, bound by survival, carrying each other forward. As the day stretched on, dark clouds gathered again on the horizon. Another storm was coming. The human clenched his jaw, tightening his grip on the girl's hand. He quickened their pace, determined to reach shelter before the sky broke open again. The girl, though exhausted, matched his steps. She no longer stumbled as much. Her body was still weak, but her will was stronger now. The snow crunched under their boots and the wind began to rise. The human scanned the land desperately for a place to hide. His eyes caught the outline of an old ruin, stone walls half buried under snow. He pointed, and the girl nodded quickly. With the last of his strength, he led her toward it. They reached the ruin just as the wind began to howl once more. The human pushed open a broken doorway and guided her inside. The wall still stood strong, shielding them from the rising storm. He collapsed against the wall, pulling her close once again. She leaned into him without hesitation this time, her trust complete. The storm raged outside, but inside the ruin there was silence. Their bodies were tired, their strength fading, yet their bond was stronger than ever. They had faced the wasteland together, and together they had survived another day. The human looked at her small frame curled against his chest. Her eyes closed peacefully, no longer filled with fear. He tightened his hold, knowing the journey was far from over. But for now they had each other, and that was enough. The ruin kept them safe through the second storm, but it was only a broken shell. The human knew they could not remain there. If they stayed, hunger would finish what the cold had started. The girl stirred beside him, her eyes opening slowly. She no longer trembled with fear when she saw his face. Instead, she looked at him with quiet trust, as though his presence alone was enough to push the cold away. When the storm ended, they stepped back into the wasteland together. The human lifted her once more when her legs grew weak, carrying her across ridges of ice and fields of snow. She pointed out safer paths when the ground cracked beneath them, guiding him toward places where the ice was strong. Step by step, they moved through the frozen world, no longer strangers, no longer alone. By the third day, the human's strength was fading. His body shook with exhaustion, his supplies almost gone. Yet every time he thought he could not go further, he looked at the girl in his arms. Her small hands clung to him, her eyes shining with fragile hope. She had trusted him with her life, and that gave him the strength to keep walking. At last, through the endless white, he saw a glimmer of metal rising above the snow. A structure, half buried, but alive with faint light. His heart quickened. It was a shelter, a human outpost, safety. He stumbled toward it, pushing past the final stretch of ice. The girl, sensing his urgency, lifted her head and looked at the lights with wide eyes. For her, it was not just a building. It was salvation. They reached the outpost gates, and the human pounded against the frozen steel. A light flickered above, and the doors slowly opened. Another human stood there, staring in shock at the sight of a man carrying a fragile alien child in his arms. The human staggered inside, his legs nearly giving out. The warmth of the outpost hit them both like a wave, melting the frost from their clothes. He lowered her gently onto a cot, his body trembling from the effort. She reached for his hand, her eyes filled with silent gratitude. The others inside rushed to bring blankets and medical supplies, but she would not let go of him. Her hand clung to his until her strength gave way and her body finally allowed her to rest. The human sat beside her, his eyes heavy, but his heart steady. He had kept his promise. Hours later, she woke in the safety of the outpost. The warmth surrounded her, food and water close at hand, yet her eyes searched only for him. When she saw him sitting nearby, exhaustion written across his face, she gave a faint smile. Her lips moved, forming weak words in her own tongue, words he could not understand. But he understood the meaning. Thank you. The others whispered questions, why he had risked so much, why he had carried her through the wasteland. He did not answer. His silence said enough. The girl, once frozen and fading, now lived because of him. She had been a stranger, a fragile life on the edge of death, yet he had given her warmth, hope, and survival. In return, she had given him something he had not expected. A reminder of why humanity fought, why they endured. Not for power, not for conquest, but for the chance to protect life, no matter how small. As the night settled over the outpost, the human sat beside her cot, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time since the storm. He felt the weight of exhaustion pull at him, but he refused to leave her side. She was more than a survivor now. She was a symbol. In the coldest wasteland, where the storm had tried to bury them both, a bond had been forged that no storm could ever break. The girl had found life again, and the human had discovered the truth of his own strength. The warmth that had saved her body had also changed his heart forever.